everyone is loath to tell the truth. No one is going to fully admit what they knew, why they didn't share information, why they didn't act on it. And so they come up with excuses and rationales. Well, the main quick early excuse was no one would have known planes would fly into buildings. We had no advance warning of this. I grew up in a small farm town in Iowa, North Iowa, not too far from Minnesota. And I was a smart kid in school, went to college, majored in French, went to law school, and actually had for a long time this idea of working for justice, you know, by joining the FBI. Like all kids, you get interested through a television show, and there was a famous Man from U.N.C.L.E. television show, very exciting, you're the good guy. And I wrote, it's a long story, but when I was 12 years old, I wrote to our paper, how do I join Uncle when I grow up? And they wrote back and said, Uncle is fictional, but in the United States we have something similar called the FBI. So by 12 years old, I already wrote to the FBI. So had this, you know, when you go to law school, I actually at that time kind of was between the Foreign Service and the State Department and the FBI, but I joined the FBI. It took 2 years to go through the processing and stuff. Hard to get hired by the FBI. You have to have physical fitness and all these things. So eventually, I'm about 27 when I joined. Initially, you work a variety of crimes. The whole FBI is about 300 different crimes, from white-collar crime and civil rights to organized crime, criminal conspiracies, to violent crimes, bank robberies, etc. So they expose you to a lot of it initially. Then I specialized in organized crime in New York City, and I worked on the mob-type cases, the very famous cases that during the 80s that were prosecuting all of the bosses of these various organized criminal conspiracies. Of course, people say conspiracy, but there really are criminal conspiracies. Even Hoover originally didn't believe in the criminal conspiracy. But so a lot of those people I worked with became later famous in the so-called War on Terror. They were people like Rudy Giuliani and Michael Chertoff. They were the prosecutors of those cases I worked with. Then I got a chance to be transferred based on seniority back almost to my home area, which the closest office was in Minnesota. And if I did that, if I transferred for seniority, I had to become the legal counsel in the office. And then there were some other duties that went with legal counsel. And I had been out of law school a long time, but I said, okay, I will do that job. And I came to teach constitutional law and even ethics, also freedom of information, and I became our media spokesperson for 7 years. There was a whole bunch of things that kind of like the extra duties. So the last 13 years, almost the last 13 years of my career, I was this legal counsel in the office. And this, of course, corresponded with when 9/11 occurs. I taught, you know, First Amendment, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendment. Mostly those are the ones, Eighth Amendment. Those are what they call the criminal process laws. And the reason for that is in the United States there is something called the exclusionary rule, that if you do something that they later determine was unconstitutional, it violates the right against unreasonable search or the right not to have a coerced confession, you lose the evidence in trial. The judge will say, we're punishing the police officer for violating the law. That means you can't introduce that evidence. And it's a very important aspect of American judicial system. So in response to that, the FBI had designated legal counsel trainers in the FBI so that you wouldn't violate those laws. I did that for 13 years. And in fact, you get to the point where a week before 9/11, I and 56 other legal counsels like myself, we were also ethics on two hats, had to give a PowerPoint ethics training, 1 hour, that had different little slides in it to all personnel of the FBI. It's ironic in hindsight. This is 1 week before 9/11. And two of the slides that later I realized, oh my goodness, you know, I say this one week and the next week we're doing just the opposite. One is, I can't recite it exactly, but it says, never do anything to puff, shade, skew, tailor, massage, or otherwise exaggerate statements of fact. That's one slide. And of course, it's very important because for FBI agents, if you exaggerate a statement of fact, someone could go to prison. An innocent person could go to prison. An innocent person could be convicted. The other one was, we never forget that you owe your highest loyalties to the Constitution, and that you should never say or do anything to undermine the constitutional rule of law or to prevent institutional embarrassment. Okay, so you have 9/11 happen, and the backstory to that is we had agents in my office that had already found one of the terrorist suspects in August, right before, 3.5 weeks before 9/11. And when they came across, the reason they came across this terrorist suspect was because flight school instructors who themselves were whistleblowers went against their bosses who said, no, take the money from the student, don't ever call anybody. They actually picked up the phone. 2 of them independently picked up the phone and called our office. They said, we've got to tell you, we've got the most suspicious flight student we've ever seen. And so within 1 day, of course, this is an example of how the real legitimate investigation of terrorism should occur. This is the extreme good example of how it should occur. The agents immediately responded. They immediately did some background, some quick study of this, and they went out. They interviewed. His name was Mousawi. He was a French Moroccan in Minnesota taking these flight school lessons. He didn't have the proper background. He even failed. There's a whole bunch of reasons that they end up putting into paper. They actually, within a day or two, they write up all the reasons for being suspicious, and they take him into custody. So this occurs on August 16th of 2001, that Mousawi is taken because his visa had lapsed. They had a reason they could put him into custody. And they take his personal effects and his laptop. But they cannot, under our law, you can't search those things. It's very complicated, and we would be here all day trying to explain this, but under the law, you had to have probable cause. So they then, and again, this is unbelievably complicated, because before 9/11, in the United States, there was something called the Wall. It was called the Wall, that prevented criminal and intelligence investigators from sharing information. And the reason for that was because if you went through this law of intelligence, the rules are looser. They don't require the exact same probable cause. So if you could say anything you're doing was through national security. If you claim it's national security and foreign policy, you don't have to follow the Fourth Amendment. So this wall had grown up, but there was problems with that because there was conflicting guidance, conflicting interpretations, etc. The agents were stovepiped in our office, and their information was not allowed to get to the court, and it was even stopped at a lower level. When you really realize why and how this stopped, most of it was due to lack of information sharing inside the FBI. The person at that next level would have known, if they had gotten through one blockage of this thing, that person would have been the person who knew that Osama bin Laden was heavily entwined with the Chechen leader Ibn Khattab. In the meantime, the French respond quickly to the request for information, and they say, oh yes, we know Mousawi was recruiting for Ibn Khattab, and his own friend was sent to die in a battle, etc. So that is known real quickly. What's not known in the FBI is who is Ibn Khattab, but the person that was the next level up There was a memo from April of 2001. The April of 2001 memo is entitled, Osama bin Laden is going to attack. He's heavily entwined with Ibn Khattab. Okay, so these are just one of many, many, many examples of so-called dots that were not connected. They had all the dots, but it's complicated, and after the day of 9/11, when it occurs, I, walking by a television, saw it, and I actually looked at it, and I turned to the person behind me and go, it's connected to our case here. It was that quick. The agent, same thing. The agent who was working it saw it, and it was like, oh my God, the worst has happened, that they actually were afraid of. The supervisor who was trying to get hit, there were 60-some emails and telephone calls, begging and pleading for them to take this at headquarters, the stovepipe. And in one of those telephone conversations, that supervisor said, don't you know this is a guy who could fly into the World Trade Center? He said this in August of 2001. And afterwards, of course, the supervisor, I don't recall that you said that. He wrote it down in his notes at the time when he was saying it. I mean, so nobody wants, again, these are things that nobody wants to talk about after 9/11. That actually these dots existed, and people did have a very good foreseeability that these things could happen. In the Mousawi case, they sit at headquarters. There was no probable cause to have gone forward. That was said for months and months. And of course, we knew this wasn't true. For a lot of reasons, we knew it wasn't true. And I was not the investigator. I didn't do this early investigation. In fact, I fault myself for not having done enough. I could have possibly made some calls. I had 21 years in the FBI. My call in might have been taken more seriously than an agent who only had 3 years in. It's possible. And I knew other ways. But in a hierarchy, I testified to the Senate Judiciary about this. In a hierarchy, if you even jump over one level, which is your boss, you can get into trouble, even for doing that, for going around people. And so that's why it's not done too much. And in our case, we thought our boss in that office, who was one level higher than me, we thought he was doing this. It was compounded. There's more to this story because our first boss was higher ranking. He had just retired. So the highest ranking boss in our office, who could have made a call to a level higher, had just retired. So there's a whole bunch of things that were going on here. The bottom line, stovepiped, stopped information. And then, okay, compound that. That's the initial failure. Compound it by now lying about 9/11, about the fact that you had no ability to know these things. That was what got to me. And so I called headquarters. I said, you can't be saying this. I actually tried to call directly to the director a week after 9/11. I made 2 or 3 calls. And I said, you are going to be blindsided because you are saying that we had no clues. And there's all kinds of information. So just be careful. You shouldn't be saying this. And they kept saying it. And this is what, of course, after a while, we gave up. After there was also an attempt to a meeting or whatever. We gave up. I wasn't the only one, by the way. We gave up and we said, okay, they're going to circle the wagons. There's not much we can do. The Joint Intelligence Committee started that January, I think, and they started producing a timeline. And by May, I got called. And I couldn't believe I was getting called because I said, I just have a little role in this. But when I got called, I thought to myself, I'm going to tell what I know. I said, this is finally the opportunity. I am going to tell them everything I got called that day. I only had about 4 or 5 days notice. And I went home, and that night I said, I got to tell them this, I got to tell them that. I started thinking mentally. I couldn't even sleep because I started thinking, I got to really put this in perspective for them. And then I thought about 3 a.m. I said, I can't sleep. You know what? I better write it down. I better jot down some notes because I will forget this. When they're talking to me, you're going to get, distracted. And so I went into the office about 3, 4 a.m. and I started writing down everything I thought that I should say. And eventually, as I was writing, it just became this memo form. And really, I was already into it, maybe a few pages, and I said, you know what, I'm going to make it into a memo, and that way, if I do forget anything, I can just give it to them. So as I'm doing this over 2 days, 3 days, I actually said, they need to have this in our own internal affairs. And the director, only 1 week he was director before 9/11, so he maybe doesn't even know exactly everything either. I said, the director, I thought to myself, well, I'm going to even go one more step around the staffers that were doing the debriefing, and I'm going to take it right to the Joint Intelligence Committee senators. And so when I got debriefed, I handed them, they said, is there anything else, Coleen, after 2 hours, if we failed to cover anything? And I said, if there is, it's in this memo. And they went, whoa, and they took it, and I walked out. I walked straight to the director's office and gave a copy, and then I walked straight to, and I didn't walk straight because you get lost in the FBI, and my knees are shaking at the time. I'm like, well, very worried. I know this is going to have some ramifications, but I didn't really realize exactly what would happen. And I took it to Internal Affairs, then I went out and got a cab. When you get to the Senate building, because of the anthrax scare, I can't even get in. I'm in a line. I actually went up to a security guard and showed him my badge, and I said, I've got to get this directly to these 2 offices. And I had a security guard take me to Feinstein and Shelby's office. And then I went home and I thought, whoa, I did it. I did it. I did mine. You know, whatever happens, you know, if they read it, my only goal was that I was hoping they would read it, because the questioning up until that point of 8.5 months, the senators didn't have even any idea. They were asked, their questionings was not even correct. Not even intelligent questions were being asked. And so I thought that was the only goal I had was, you know, if they read it, maybe they will be smarter about what to ask of officials. And a day later, when I came home, this would have been the day after I came back, my husband came down the driveway and said, Coleen, they've read your memo. I go, what are you talking about? C-SPAN was carrying a hearing, and I didn't even know this hearing was to take place, but a hearing of the FBI director and senators, and he said, I know they were asking because they're using the same, you know, they were using stuff from your memo. And I thought, oh my gosh, this has actually amounted to something. However, the NSA and the CIA and other agencies, their failures don't have that. Because you know why? No one in those places told the truth initially. Or at least maybe if they did, it got quashed up. You know, this memo that Time Magazine 2 weeks later says blockbuster memo or super memo or something like this. It's their cover, and they got an old picture of me on there and Mousawi. It's online still, and initially the FBI tried to post-classify it so it would not get out by blacking out 2 words. You know, they really stretched. They blocked out French intelligence. That's what they blocked out. So it was not classified, of course, and they then used this to talk about firing me. So I heard this through a source that they were talking about. I go, what? I was naive, no idea. I'm supposed to tell what I know to the Joint Intelligence Committee. We always believed that they had oversight over the FBI and that they had higher clearances. And so for this talk of being fired and stuff, it was incredible. And also the fact I had no idea that getting it out to the public would be the only thing that would possibly save my job. I never had any concept of this. But it turns out that getting it out then, when it went public, then it was harder to fire me. Just to get this out so I don't forget it, the 9/11 Commission concludes that these main failures are due to failure to share information within the agencies, what we call stovepiping, that's the Mousawi case, failure to share between agencies information, that's where the CIA doesn't tell the FBI, but there's many other examples. And then the last one, this is the critical one that the government never repeats, even though the 9/11 Commission says it, failure to share information with the public. And that's something now that's been turned on its head and said that information that's shared with the public will hurt you. That's going to, oh, millions of people will be killed because of Edward Snowden's disclosures. It is precisely the opposite. What we're really talking about here is excessive secrecy. You know, none of us have a problem with things that for that period of time really are valid to be secret. But the problem is when they're using this, go back to my slide, my PowerPoint, to prevent institutional embarrassment and to prevent the truth from getting out because they don't want to be embarrassed and found guilty, etc. People don't want to know these things in a lot of ways because you can blissfully, ignorance is bliss. And, you know, to do your job, you've got to kind of have a little tunnel vision. Once you start seeing, I'm in a war on terror, and we're killing more people, and the threats going up, and whatever. And I only had 2 years. I was eligible at age 50 to retire, so I only had to make it to retirement. But already the Iraq War started, and I wrote a second memo about it because I knew that this was wrong. I knew it was that there wasn't the evidence of Saddam being aligned with Al-Qaeda and allowing Al-Qaeda. I knew that wasn't correct, and I knew that Iraq had no connection. So I wrote a second memo. And that, of course, was really, really the end with my peers, because the war fever, especially in the FBI, in March of 2003, there was absolutely no one I knew that was not for a war on Iraq. The propaganda, you know, this wouldn't be in the general public this bad, but in the FBI, there was extreme war fever. And this was so excruciating because I ended up sitting in a room when they started shock and awe a couple of weeks later after my memo about Iraq would prove counterproductive. I had to sit in a room with the TV going on where they were showing the bombs, and all the male agents just, yip, yay, we killed some more, blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, it was pretty difficult to go into work and think, oh, I joined this because I was on the side of justice and good guys, and now see that everybody immediately around me. But unfortunately, this is the way, this is a dynamic, and people get caught up in this. And ultimately, a few months later, after my memo, people didn't hate me as much. They initially kind of hated me for that, but after a period of time, I actually was the competent legal counsel, and so people would ask me questions and stuff, and there was supposed to be somebody else, but I found out they were coming to me instead of the other person because I knew more, etc. So it kind of changed real quickly, and I think many times people give up too soon. I might have been one that actually gave up too soon on this. I might have just persisted and said I shouldn't step down, but after I wrote the memo about Iraq, I stepped down from my legal position. And so I went down, lost some salary, down to from a 14 to a 13, and it goes into my pension. My pension's a little lower because of having spoken out on Iraq. And then, yes, when I had my age 50, I retired. with my benefits for same week as my birthday. And I had kind of actually planned in my head, because my husband and I are reversed, and he brought up our kids and stuff. I had always actually planned to do an early retirement, you know, but this really compounded it. If nothing else, whatever you achieved in the scheme of things, short term, may be very minimal. You know, people, you know, say, what did you achieve? Well, just this little bit and whatever. That might be the case. Maybe nothing has changed. However, by speaking out, you have actually, at least for yourself, made it possible to have your conscience allow you to continue. And the people who are involved in some level of complicity or wrongdoing in something, who then continue to suppress it, and if their conscience cannot, if they come up with this confrontation, they don't have an ego defense. And these are, for the example, are the people coming back from war zones. If you witness terrible things, if you do nothing about them, at some point you're going to have a really difficult time. If I had not done, this is the second memo on Iraq, it was even more difficult than the one on, and if I had not done that, I would say, who am I to criticize anybody? I'm the same person who went along with this. And at the very least, it gives you an ability to maybe, you know, continue on for another day. And in theologies, they would say it saves your soul or whatever. And I think that there's a lot to that, because ultimately we don't know what the future is going to be. We just have to try our hardest. And I don't think there's much of an option in terms of trying. I think we all have to do what we can. And then, you know, time usually is going to vindicate people who do the right thing. May not be tomorrow, it may take 40, 50 years, whatever, but ultimately time vindicates their actions.